Ever feel like I'm seeing more and more conflict between men and women online?
Hmm.
In the news, maybe, even in my own life.
It's definitely something you hear about a lot, a growing tension.
Yeah, it's hard to ignore.
Mhm.
So today, we're diving deep into this global phenomenon, this
Mhm.
increasing gender antagonism. You shared some, well, truly fascinating material,
Mhm.
exploring the current state, the causes, the effects, and maybe some ways forward.
Right. The sources cover quite a bit of ground from
Mm.
different parts of the world.
They really do. They paint this picture from, various corners of the world, highlighting some striking similarities, but also some, like, unique regional twists that really made me think.
Yeah, the local context definitely shape how it plays out.
So our goal today is to unpack what's really going on here, move beyond the surface arguments I often see, and try to identify the core drivers of this tension. We'll look at several countries, explore why it's happening, the consequences, and, yeah, touch on potential solutions, all to give you a clearer understanding.
And it's interesting just how widespread this friction feels looking across the material you gathered. It's definitely not just one place.
Exactly. Let's maybe start with South Korea.
Yeah.
Based on what I've read, it might be, well, the most intense example globally. Almost sounds like a pressure cooker.
It certainly seems that way.
One of the big things, it seems, one of the key issues, is the mandatory 2-year military service for men, while women are exempt.
Hmm.
The material I saw strongly suggests this creates a significant sense of unfairness among many men.
That sense of perceived inequity is a really powerful catalyst. It comes up again and again.
Hmm.
And then you layer on top of that the stark reality of economic disparity, a 31% gender pay gap in 2022. That's the highest in the OECD.
The highest, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And combine that with the troubling prevalence of violence against women, something like 90% of victims are female, you can really see why tensions are just incredibly high there.
That pay gap isn't just numbers, is it? I imagine it fuels that resentment about military service, too, like men seeing women maybe having an easier path financially.
That's certainly a perspective reflected in the sources, yeah. It all feeds into this complex dynamic of grievance.
Right, and the response from some women there has been equally powerful, maybe equally direct, this 4B movement. No marriage, no childbirth, no dating, no sex. That's a pretty profound statement of dissatisfaction, I thought.
It truly is. I mean, it speaks to a really dope level of disillusionment, doesn't it? A sort of complete rejection of traditional societal roles and expectations.
Definitely. And then there's that sharp generational divide mentioned.
Right.
On feminism, a majority of young men opposed, a majority of young women supportive.
That divide is stark.
Yeah.
And it clearly intensified the political polarization. You could see it in the voting patterns in the 2022 presidential election.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so moving over to China. The pressures seem, well, different, but maybe no less intense. The material I looked at really emphasizes the immense economic burden on men, especially housing costs, like Beijing buying a home, around 7 million RMB.
Astronomical figures, yeah.
And then the whole bride price tradition, which can be tens of thousands of RMB.
Mm-hmm.
It struck me that a 2023 survey found 70% of people still think men should be responsible for buying the house.
The weight of those expectations is just enormous, and it creates this interesting tension when you consider the increasing number of highly educated women. Females were 51% of postgraduate students back in 2020.
Right, so women are achieving academically,
Yeah.
but still facing big challenges in their careers.
Yeah.
The low percentage in senior management, for instance.
Precisely. Only about 10.2% in senior management. So you have academic success here, but career roadblocks there. It's a disconnect.
That imbalance, yeah, it seems bound to cause friction. And then there's that societal pressure, the really negative label of leftover women if you're not married by a certain age.
A very loaded term.
Plus, the online clashes mentioned sound intense. Field feminism versus male chauvinist pigs.
Yeah, the online space can be pretty polarized.
And the sheer numbers, 41 million unmarried women, 50 million unmarried men aged 30-44 in 2020. It just underscores the scale of this in China.
Absolutely. Now, Japan, it presents maybe a calmer exterior,
Yeah.
but the sources suggest there's quite a bit going on underneath.
Right, simmering tensions maybe?
Sort of. You've got this deeply entrenched male-dominated culture, really low representation of women in leadership. 7.6% female executives in 2022, I think.
Wow, that low.
Yeah. And these persistent traditional expectations for women in the workplace, it's still a powerful force.
And the economic pressures on men are still very real there too, right? Exorbitant housing costs like in Tokyo.
Definitely. That pressure hasn't gone away.
And there's still that pressure on women to marry, but a lot aren't. Like 20% of women age 30, 34 are unmarried. It feels like, I don't know, like both men and women are pushing back in different ways against these traditional paths.
That's a good way to put it. You see the emergence of herbivore men, these guys who are just kind of uninterested in romance or marriage.
Right, I read about that.
And alongside that, a growing number of women choosing not to marry or have kids. And it's led to this record low number of marriages in 2023, only about 500,000. It's a quieter shift than in Korea, maybe, but still profound.
Okay, turning to the U.S., it feels like here a lot of this gender antagonism gets really tangled up with political divisions.
Very much so. It maps onto the political landscape quite strongly.
The material mentions the red pill movement, for example. Some men feeling women have advantages now in education or the workplace.
Citing things like the higher percentage of women in university.
Yeah, 56% female university students.
Hmm.
But then, women are still really concerned about the gender pay gap, earning 82% of men's wages in 2022. And obviously the whole hashtag #MeToo movement against sexual violence, still very resonant issues.
Absolutely. And what's really notable in the U.S., as you said, is how these gender dynamics showed up in the 2020 election results. A clear political split along gender lines, especially among younger people.
Right. Young men leaning more conservative, young women more liberal.
Exactly. It really highlights how these tensions are shaping, the broader political conversation.
Okay, finally, India. The scale there. 1.3 billion people.
Mm-hmm.
And the deeply entrenched patriarchal structures, well, they paint a pretty stark picture, I found.
It's a very different context in many ways, yes.
The low female employment rate, only 20%. The high prevalence of domestic violence, 40% of women in 2022 reported experiencing it. And child marriage still being an issue.
These are deeply rooted challenges.
But the material also points to increasing education levels among urban women. 40% of university students are female now, and a growing resistance, even if it's not always, publicly voiced.
Right. And you are seeing more feminist voices emerging online in India. It's a significant development.
Yeah.
So while maybe the overt conflict isn't as pronounced as, say, South Korea, that underlying tension is definitely there. Men feeling their traditional status is challenged, women feeling oppressed. It's brewing.
Okay, so if I try and pull this all together, this global picture,
Yeah.
it seems like South Korea is definitely a major hotspot. Really open, intense conflict.
Agreed.
China and Japan seem to have these significant tensions, but maybe simmering more beneath the surface.
More controlled, perhaps, or expressed differently.
In the U.S., it's so tangled up with politics. And India feels more suppressed, maybe, but still very real antagonism there. What really struck me, though, was the intensity, specifically in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea. It feels particularly acute there.
That's a very astute observation. And the sources really point towards a key underlying factor driving this, especially in East Asia. This intense pressure cooker situation, often referred to as involution.
Okay, involution. I need to get my head around this. So my understanding from the material is it means this really fierce competition for what feels like limited resources, like everyone's running faster but not getting further ahead.
That's a great way to think about it. It's like intense internal competition that doesn't necessarily lead to overall progress or expansion. Think of that highly competitive exam analogy. Everyone studies like mad, but the number of A grades stays the same. It breeds frustration, rivalry.
Got it. So how does that fuel the gender antagonism?
Well, look at the extreme economic pressures we already talked about in China, Japan, and Korea.
Yeah.
The housing costs, you mentioned Seoul, Beijing, Tokyo, they're just, well, frankly, astronomical for many young people. Add the demanding work cultures, the 996 idea in China.
Right, 90 or 6 days a week.
Exactly. And often crippling debt, like housing loans. You've got a generation feeling incredibly squeezed financially. And men in particular often feel this immense pressure to be the primary provider in such a hyper-competitive environment that can feel completely overwhelming.
That makes a lot of sense. If the economic pie feels smaller or harder to get a piece of, I can absolutely see how anxieties would skyrocket. And the material also brought up that point about high female education levels, but alongside persistent workplace inequality.
Precisely. That's a critical piece. You have more and more highly educated women entering a workforce where they still face significant pay gaps like we saw in Korea, and fewer opportunities for advancement like the low exec numbers in China and Japan.
Right.
So it creates this understandable resentment, this frustration maybe on both sides. Men might feel their traditional provider role is harder and maybe challenged by qualified women, while women feel, understandably, held back and undervalued despite their qualifications.
And it's not just about the money, is it? The cultural aspect.
Yep.
The material I read talked a lot about Confucian values in China, Japan, Korea.
That's absolutely right. These long-standing traditional gender roles, man as breadwinner, woman as homemaker, they're increasingly clashing with women's desire for, actual equality and for partners who fit a more modern view of relationships.
Hmm.
So when women perceive a scarcity of men who meet these sort of evolving expectations, maybe men who are willing to share chores equally, support their careers, you see these responses, like marrying upwards in China, trying to find financial security that way, or the 4B movement in Korea, just opting out entirely, or non-marriage in Japan.
And the reactions from men that the sources describe, they're not always understanding, are they? This feeling that feminism has gone too far, the resentment over things like military service exemption in Korea, accusations of gold digging in China,
Right.
and that whole herbivore trend in Japan, it all suggests a really complex pushback.
It's definitely complex, and if we zoom out again, you see parallels elsewhere. The economic pressures in the U.S., high housing, student debt combined with political polarization and these differing views on gender advantages,
Yeah.
it creates its own unique flavor of antagonism. And in India, the sheer pressure of population and limited resources just makes those existing male-dominated cultural norms even tougher, even as we see the beginnings of female resistance gaining traction.
So the core logic seems to be, involution shrinks the perceived cake, making everyone feel like they're fighting over scraps. Men then resent women's expectations feeling too high for this environment, and women resent men's perceived inability or unwillingness to meet their needs or share burdens equally.
That captures the dynamic well, yes.
And these deep traditional norms just amplify everything, making East Asia particularly volatile because you have that combination of involution and Confucian culture, plus specific extras like Korean conscription.
Exactly. That combination seems particularly potent.
And India. The underlying tensions are huge, but maybe the overt conflict is still, I don't know, developing, less visible for now.
Perhaps less widespread or overtly expressed compared to East Asia, but definitely brewing, especially in urban centers. And one of the biggest, most concerning consequences of all this antagonism, as the material clearly shows, is this looming demographic crisis.
Right, the impact on birth rates and singlehood.
Precisely. We're seeing alarmingly low birth rates and a huge rise in single people, which is leading to societies aging incredibly fast.
The birth rate numbers I saw were honestly shocking. South Korea at 0.78, that's the lowest in the world.
It's unprecedented.
And China at 1.3, Japan 1.26. I mean, compared to the OECD average of around 1.6, or even the US at 1.6, and India is still around 2.0, these are incredibly low.
They really are, and the sources directly link this to falling marriage rates. South Korea, China, Japan all saw record low marriage numbers in 2023.
People just aren't partnering up or aren't having kids when they do.
Or both. And the rise of singlehood itself is another key trend. The percentage of unmarried people in their 30s and older is really high across these countries.
And South Korea 30%, China 20% with those huge numbers we mentioned, Japan 25%, even the US around 25%.
Right.
India's lower, maybe 10%, but rising in cities.
Right. And the reasons vary. Women often cite wanting freedom, independence. Some men feel they just don't have the financial resources, or they reject that traditional provider role.
And it ties right back to what we discussed earlier, doesn't it? Korea's 4B movement is an explicit rejection of marriage and kids. China's leftover women resisting pressure. Japan's herbivore men opting out. And this newer trend of urban singlehood in India.
Exactly. They're all expressions of these underlying shifts and tensions.
And the consequences down the line.
Well, the inevitable outcomes are aging populations, shrinking workforces, and really serious questions about who will care for the elderly.
Yeah, the percentages for people over 65 are already high in places like Japan.
Japan's at 28%, South Korea 17%, China 14%. Even India's 6% is aging fast.
It paints this picture of like overworked, financially strained young people who just can't afford or maybe don't prioritize having kids, leading to a societal slowdown.
That's the major concern, yes, a kind of demographic trap.
So, okay, given this really complex and honestly kind of concerning picture, what potential ways forward did the material I looked at suggest? Does it offer any hope?
It does acknowledge how deep-rooted this all is, but it suggests potential paths for change, both sort of short-term and longer-term ideas.
Okay, short term.
In the short term, it really emphasizes the need for a shift in mindsets and supportive government policies.
Mindsets like a more equitable distribution of responsibilities and relationships.
Exactly. That came up strongly. And there was that interesting statistic from China, 40% of young people being open to equal marriage, sharing housing costs, housework.
That does sound like a positive sign, yeah.
Yeah,
A potential shift.
it is. And on the policy side, maybe looking at examples from Northern Europe, Sweden's anti-discrimination laws, for instance, leading to more women in executive roles.
Right, 20% female executives there.
So policies like that, plus things like rent subsidies,
Yeah.
measures to reduce the cost of living, things that ease the economic pressure cooker.
The U.S. child tax credit in 2022 was mentioned as having some positive impact, too.
Yeah, direct financial support can make a difference.
Okay, and longer-term strategies. What do the sources suggest there?
Longer term, it really comes back to tackling the underlying economic pressure.
Hmm.
So broader economic development, obviously, but also specific measures,
Like what?
like actively trying to reduce housing prices. Japan actually saw a drop after 2000. It's not impossible. And shortening working hours. Contrasting South Korea's intense culture with, say, Europe's 35-hour week. Addressing that involution pressure directly.
Makes sense. Ease the competition, maybe reduce the stress.
Exactly. And then there was a more potentially controversial perspective about population growth itself.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, the argument presented was that with a global population now at 8 billion, resource scarcity is a huge issue. And maybe smaller average family sizes could ultimately mean more resources per person.
I see. Potentially easing that involution, that intense competition.
That was the idea. Looking at the disparity, say, between higher birth rates in rural India versus lower rates in urban areas, and suggesting that smaller families might reduce that gender-based competition over scarce resources. It frames children not just as fulfilling parental needs, but in a broader resource context.
It's definitely a thought-provoking angle, considering the bigger picture, the strain on resources. But the material I read, it seemed to conclude on a fairly, realistic note.
Yes, quite sober, I'd say. The emphasis was that without really tackling that core issue of involution and fostering significant shifts in mindsets, these trends, the antagonism, the singlehood, are likely to continue, maybe even get worse.
So all these movements and trends, the 4B, leftover women, herbivore men, urban non-marriage in India, they're essentially symptoms.
Symptoms of that underlying resource scarcity and competition, that was the core argument presented. Without treating the root cause, the symptoms are likely to persist.
Right. Okay, so to sort of wrap this up, it seems this gender antagonism is really significant global challenge. East Asia facing particularly intense pressure, driven by that potent mix of economic competition, involution, and deep cultural factors. And the consequences are already crystal clear. Plummeting birth rates, rising singlehood. The potential ways forward involve shifting expectations towards more equality, supportive government policies, easing economic burdens, and maybe even thinking about population size and resources.
That sums it up well.
So, considering how deep these issues run and how interconnected everything is, economics, culture, demographics, what strikes me as the most critical leverage point. Where could change make the biggest difference in fostering more positive gender dynamics in the years ahead? It's a huge question to ponder.